What happens to plants in the presence of excess nitrogen? So there are some signs that you can observe. For example, you have typically succulent growth. You actually have more growth, more vegetative growth. The leaves simply look darker in terms of green. Sometimes the leaves are thicker and they feel just more brittle. Sometimes in the presence of excess nitrogen, you have spindly leaves, although that's not very often. More often than not, you have poor fruit set, which means in this case, for excessive nitrogen, you have more vegetative growth than you have reproductive growth. And a good example is shown on the next slide. So a good example of excessive vegetative growth over reproductive growth is shown here in the bottom left-hand corner with tomatoes. And tomato is classic in terms of showing this symptom in the presence of excess nitrogen. The plant looks fantastic, right? If you were growing this plant in your backyard, your neighbors would think you are a tomato god. And they would probably realize shortly, midway through the growing season, when tomatoes are starting to turn red or later in the season, and there's no red or very little red in your tomato plants, and you made an oops. You over applied nitrogen and you forced vegetative growth over reproductive growth. Leaves do curl and they become spindly. In this case of corn in the top left-hand corner, this is a function of excess nitrogen and greater above ground vegetative growth, causing more removal of water from the soil because there's greater below ground growth, and the plant is suffering from drought simply because of excess nitrogen. In the top right-hand corner picture, you see low, optimal, and excessive nitrogen, and it's really hard to tell the difference between optimal and excessive. But if you're a producer, why would you want to be an excessive when optimal actually gives you probably the same yield as excessive? So over on the right-hand side, you wasted money to get to the same yield as you would under optimal conditions. And in fact, sometimes the yield may actually decrease because there's a tendency for greater above ground vegetative growth versus reproductive growth. And sometimes, this might be called luxury consumption. And maybe some of you have heard of this, where you're on the plateau in terms of maximizing yield, but the plant is simply taking up more nitrogen and consuming or luxury consuming nitrogen, but maintaining a yield, but not increasing the yield. And this is not what we want to see in production agricultural settings. So with that said, what do you think we could do to reduce excess nitrogen in the environment? And if you think a little bit about the nitrogen cycle and maybe what you've observed if you've worked in Ohio agriculture or other ecosystems long enough, what do you know about the nitrogen cycle that you might be able to tweak? So the nitrogen cycle is complex, right? And how do we reduce plant available nitrogen in the nitrogen cycle? So you can think of loss pathways, volatilization, that might be a challenge. Denitrification, that might not be totally out of the question in Ohio. If you could flood the soil, if you could raise the water table, maybe during the off season. You could certainly leach nitrogen. That's a loss pathway that occurs readily here in Ohio. You could tie up nitrogen as organic nitrogen, and you could do this a couple different ways, right? You could force nitrogen by one means or another into microorganism tissue, which is what we'll talk about in the next point. You could grow a cover crop, and tie up nitrogen in the organic form to be slowly released or mineralized over time. You could grow a cover crop. I guess you could remove that cover crop, especially if it's a cover crop that could be used for animals. Maybe you could just grow a cover crop, tie up the nitrogen in the above ground plant material, and then introduce animals or livestock into the system. Anything to remove nitrogen from the soil is the key with respect to excess nitrogen. Think about, how about the carbon to nitrogen ratio? You know, if we have excess nitrogen in the soil, can we somehow alter, at least temporarily, the carbon to nitrogen ratio in the soil to force nitrogen to be placed into microbial tissue? So we can do this. We can add a carbon source in the form of a material that does not have a low carbon to nitrogen ratio. It has to have a high carbon to nitrogen ratio to force immobilization. So we're talking about carbon to nitrogen ratios greater than 30:1. And you could do this. It could be expensive though. In fact, there's been some studies, especially on cheatgrass and cheatgrass invasion in the Western United States, where if you added sugar to a soil, the carbon to nitrogen ratio becomes astronomical, and it reduces nitrogen availability to cheatgrass, and you can actually control cheatgrass invasion by doing this, but it's not cheap, but it can be done. So let's stop here with our discussion regarding excess nitrogen.